Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Oh, okay. We're supposed to start? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Bexell, and I'll be the moderator for this session called Reshaping Education. I'm from a university just down the road, the University of Denver, where I'm a clinical associate professor in the Graduate School of Social Work, as well as the faculty director of our Center for Sustainability, which serves our whole campus. I'm very excited to be hosting this particular session. But before I get started, some business to move through. Today is Thursday, April 13th at 12:30 p.m. And again, the title of this session is Reshaping Education. To get started, I would like to acknowledge that Boulder is on the ancestral homelands and unceded territory of Indigenous peoples who have traversed, lived in, and stewarded lands in the Boulder Valley since time immemorial. Those Indigenous nations include the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. Another thing before we get started is that we want you all to have a lot of chances to ask questions. You've probably been in a few sessions already today, and the sessions are using a similar strategy. But anytime you do have a question, please just raise your hand, and one of the producers will come by with a note card and hand it to you. Then you can take your time writing out your question. Please write really clearly so that I can read it, and make it as to the point as you possibly can. Then raise your hand again, and producers will come around and bring that question card up to me. So now I'd like to do brief introductions of each of our panelists. Also know that these are brief, and you can look at the CWA website to learn more about each of the panelists. And of course, these days, you can Google them. So with that, let's start here with Wisdom, who is the National Director of the NAACP Youth and College Division, where he serves more than 700 youth councils who are involved in the fight for civil rights. Something really neat, there's a lot of neat things about Wisdom, is that in 2020 he was named Complex Life's one of 32 young activists who are changing the world. I also had a chance to ask Wisdom about some really cool stuff, and he is totally into bungee jumping and skydiving and is a self-professed adrenaline junkie. I also learned he's been on MSNBC and CNN, so this is Wisdom. And next on the list is David Orr down at the other end of the table, who is the Paul Sears Distinguished Professor of Environmental Studies and Politics, Emeritus at Oberlin College in Ohio. David is also the author of 8 books and, wait for it, 250 articles, reviews, and chapters. And in the circles I run in, I also know him as one of the most internationally acclaimed educators for sustainability. So that is David. Next is James Rattling, who is Research Associate of Cooperative Institute Research Environmental Sciences, right here at UC Boulder, also fondly called Ceres.
Go Buffs.
He is also the co-PI of the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. And his work focuses on developing programs at the interface of traditional ecological knowledge and Western science. He is also a member and citizen of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe. And something super fun I learned about James is that he has been in a Hollywood movie, Gambler 3. So go home and check it out this weekend. Our little touch with fame here today. And last but not least, we have Jevin West, who is Associate Professor of the Information School at the University of Washington. He is the co-founder of the Center for an Informed Public at UW, which is aimed at resisting strategic misinformation, promoting an informed society, and democratic discourse. A really fun thing about Jevin is he has a book that he has published called Calling Bullshit: The Art of Skepticism in a Data-Driven World. Don't tell my mom that I cussed in front of all of you today. So Jevin said he's gotten in a little trouble at home too with that title. And something really cool about Jevin, and something remarkable since our panel is on education, is never in his life has he ever missed even one day of school. So if any of you are doctors,
I love school. So.
Any of you are doctors, you probably want to study his immune system, because that's impressive. So with that, we're going to start with opening comments, be writing questions as everybody's talking. Is there anybody who would like to share their opening comments first? Otherwise, I'm an educator, I will call on you. Anyone?
Get us started. Get us started, Dave.
Get us going. The Marine Corps system of volunteers. I want volunteers, you, and you. All right, we've got, this is a big subject. And how do you adapt to climate change as a school or university? And first thing is get rid of your football team. And you switch to flag football. It saves you a lot of coaching costs. Now that I've got you all against me, let me tell you what I really think. When we list problems and solutions, we start with, oh, it's technology, or it's economics, or it's something like that. Education is down at the bottom of the list. I've got a couple of propositions here. Number one, education shouldn't be at the bottom of the list. It is the heart of what ails us. That disorder we see out there, we call it climate change or climate chaos or species loss or whatever, that reflects a prior disorder in how we think and how badly we think and how badly we think about things that we ought to think about very well and very carefully, which means systematically. So systems thinking is one of the goals of this. Now what that does for all of us that are in this world of education is to say that we've got to begin to rethink what education is all about relative to what it does in the world. So if you're a student here, one of the things that you have to work out is what do you want to do with this one wild, crazy life that you have, as a poet famously put it. For those of us on the other side of the agenda, what our goal is to figure out what we do to add to that process of rethinking, how you fit in the world. And you have to first start with what is the world? What's going on in the world? Where do I want to make a difference? Where do I want to make my mark? What is my legacy in this world? So education is not a minor thing. It is number one. It is the most important thing. There are three big problems we have to confront, and they're not small problems. The university was invented, give or take, about 1,000 years ago, or a wee bit more, and it was premised, its first mission was to propagate religion of various sorts and so forth. So it was all about religion. In the scientific revolution, it became part of building the knowledge society, and so science became critically important to it. When you move into the modern world, though, the university changed its function. It became an adjunct to industrial society, the domination of nature. And so expanding the human realm in the world. And that wasn't all bad. It just was a mission that drove out all the other missions. And now we have to think about what does the university or colleges or public schools do relative to the survivability of the human race. How do we make ourselves, give ourselves tenure, as it were? And the first question there is, why do we deserve it? There's a famous Islamic tale called the Tale of the Jinn. And in the Tale of the Jinn, humanity is in the docket. And animals are given speech and sentience. They can think. And so eagles and marmots and wolves and buffalo are in the jury box. And I used to ask my students, if you were the attorney representing humanity in that particular scenario, what case could you make for us? And since I taught at Oberlin students are a fairly pessimistic bunch and so forth. And they say, well, there's no case you can make. And that is an answer. And then you think about it more deeply. I mean, we've done things that are absolutely majestic. I mean, think of your favorite poet or writer or musician and so forth. We deserve to be sustained, but if we knew why we deserve to be sustained, we would know better how to go about that process and what to do. And so the first thing about education is to rethink what we want to educe from students. What is it we want to bring forth from students? I want to say one more thing. I work now at Arizona State University as something called a professor of practice. My granddaughter looked at me when I told her that, and she said, "Granddad, you're really too old to be practicing. You ought to actually do something now." And then she said, "Before it's too late." She is no longer in the family will. But as professor of practice at Arizona State, what we're aiming to do there and elsewhere, including some Colorado institutions, is to set a mission statement that reflects the reality of our situation. So start with this. Number one, no student, whatever their major, can graduate from University of Colorado without knowing what planet they're on and how it works as a physical system. So if you're a lawyer or going to business or whatever, you have to understand Earth system science. Number two, you have to understand democracy and why it's important. This amazing gift that was fought for eons. You have to have a basic understanding of why we, the people, in all our various diversities and forms and so forth, why we matter, and why we ought to have a say in how we're governed, and by whom, and to what purposes. Thirdly, no student should graduate without understanding how these two things are linked. They're flip sides of the same coin. The climate chaos around us isn't a matter of our technology failed. That didn't happen. It's not even a matter of economics. It was a matter of our politics. They were corrupted. The previous panel mentioned, Citizens United and the subsidies that we give oil business and so forth. This was not an accident. This was working out of the rules of the system set up around fossil fuels. Now, the last thing is this. Begin to think about a university, and there are roughly 10 or 11 functions of universities, all the way from education, of courses, all the way out to alumni affairs. And I'll start with alumni affairs. Imagine, since CWA is largely driven, I guess, or organized by you alums, imagine organizing alumni from every college and university in the country around climate change and what we do about it and how we build a survivable future or a thrivable future even for our great-grandchildren and beyond. That is a lot of brain power, that's a lot of experience, that's a lot of money, that's a lot of wisdom. Imagine harnessing 5% or 10% of the alums, or maybe 20%, or maybe just get all the AARP people to join and fight for a survivable future. But think of those functions, and if we in higher education could better deploy those functions around the basic principles of sustainability, justice, fairness, and decency over the long term, we might have a chance of turning this around. So the last thing I'll say is this. In the public eye, education is 6th, 8th, 9th, 10th on the list of the critical things we have to do. I say it's number one. We face a crisis in how we think. That has to be changed. All that chaos out there reflects an internal chaos between our ears. We need to improve that. So if we can do that, we have a fighting chance of building a decent, survivable, sustainable, beautiful future. If we can't, I don't think that we will. Thank you.
How about we just come back this way? Jevin,
come
do you
back this
mind
way.
going next?
That's going to be tough to follow. I believe so much in what was just said, and I'll actually just really underscore the importance of education. Clearly, we're biased a little bit because most of us have a large foot in education, but I think a lot about this issue of misinformation and how it affects everything that we're doing when it comes to climate policies and population health and economic, a lot of the economic challenges that we see around the world. And we can't get those things solved if we can't address misinformation. And in our center, I get a lot of credit for bringing in big NSF grants and NIH grants to study these things. And you get a lot of the attention around the books you write and the research papers you write and the policies you influence, but nothing is more important than the work that we do as educators on campus and in the public. This is a public institution here in Colorado. I work at a large public institution, and when I was thinking about this panel, I really was thinking about, from my perspective, working at a large public university, what are my concerns? And maybe that would inform how I would reshape, if I had that control, to reshape education. So I'm going to list a few things that concern me. Number one, the form of the university has changed for better and for worse in becoming a place where a lot of times the administrators care more about the money I bring in than the teaching that I do. And I know I'm going to get in trouble, and I think this is being recorded. I'm probably going to get in trouble by my administrators for saying this. And also the cost to run a university with a lot of the administration. And again, we need a lot of the administration. But I've been doing some behind the napkin calculations about how we could reduce the cost of tuition for students if we became more efficient and we weren't overinflated with administration. So that would release some of the problems there, but that's a whole other issue. Another issue that we have at universities is trust. Not amongst this group. You guys self-selected to come here and be a part of this conversation over the next couple of years, but I'm talking about the rest of the United States and the rest of the world. There have been many recent studies from Pew and other organizations that have looked at the level of trust for institutions across the demographics, and it's not good. We have a big trust issue, and we need to engage in the public exactly how we are in this particular meeting. And one of the things that I'd love to see more in a world that's, where we're overwhelmed with information and we're all learning, is to do more intergenerational learning, exactly what we're doing here. So we have at our university, and I know they have it here and at most public universities, the ability for students we call them access students, so they can be citizens of the state of Washington, where I'm at, and they can take classes. And I've been allowing more and more access students into my classroom to work with the 20-year-olds and the 19-year-olds, and I have seen some of the most amazing opportunities of learning with that kind of intergenerational learning. I'd love to see more of that. We have to address another big concern is technology. I'm going to a conference right after this on the effects of isolation on society, and we're seeing that with students. We're seeing rises in mental health, a mental health crisis, and I really think that technology can help us in many ways, but it's becoming a problem too. I think a lot of students that were in the pandemic times would still want to be in their pajamas taking, courses, but we have to bring them back in person. I think that's a big thing in thinking about sort of reshaping education. And of course, we have these new technologies that are changing how I do things in my classroom. ChatGPT has really upended a lot of the ways in which I teach, at least writing in my course. But I've kind of leaned into it because students are going to be using it outside of the university, and so I allow them to use ChatGPT as long as they let me know that they're using it, even on tests. And I'm learning a lot. I'm learning that I haven't written a lot of good questions in the past, and I need those to be fixed. And students are teaching me as much about these new technologies as I'm teaching them. And so I think a lot of ways we have to lean in, but also teach them the guardrails behind these. And then also I think one of the most important byproducts or products of the education process, and this is cliche and it's been repeated for centuries, but it's the critical thinking aspect. And I think when I look across our course content, I think there's so many courses that aren't providing that element. Of course, I teach critical thinking, so that's something I care a lot about, but the way that things change so fast in society, we need to be teaching students how to think, not always just what to think. And so, the other thing is to harness students' passions. I think we sort of come up with curriculum and we sort of set it in stone, and it's really hard to shake it. We need to be able to make it more flexible so that students, when they're really passionate about issues around climate or around population health, we can figure out ways to run with it. So I'll give you one example of things that we're doing to change our curriculum. We lead what are called directed research groups now. At these institutions like Colorado and my university, University of Washington, we're known for our research. And we're finally starting to engage we've always engaged to some degree, but now we're engaging it formally in our curriculum to bring students across, not just a few that are interested in going to get a PhD or go to medical school. These are all students to engage in the research that's being done on important human issues. And so we call them directed research groups. So it's changing how we're doing the curriculum design. It's been a big challenge, but I think that's a big area that I'm excited about when I think of the next form of education, that it's working hand in hand with the researchers, policymakers, et cetera, at universities. So those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about. Lots more, but I'll pass it on to my colleagues. Oh, thanks.
Well, good afternoon. I want to begin by introducing myself in my Lakota language. So we say, when we come before a group like this, we say, "Haumi dakiapi, chante washte na pechu zapolo. James Rattling lifi machapi na su chango Lakota uyate hamataha." I greet you from my heart with a handshake, and I am known as James Rattling Leaf, and I am from the Rosewood Sioux tribe. You know, when I was walking to the campus, you guys need better parking here. Even though I'm from here, but I'm not really from here. But I was walking under that walkway of Broadway, and saw these guys over there in the corner there. You probably see all these guys there on the corner there, and somebody yelled up to me and said, "How kola? How kola?" He said to me. I didn't know who said it. I was walking to get here, but to me, it's always interesting where I go and what I hear and what I see. As an Indigenous person, for the last few years, I've had tremendous opportunities to travel and to speak on the things we're talking about today. And so I want to talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing here at the university, which I'm very proud of. About 5 years ago, I was asked to join a proposal to bring a climate adaptation science center here to Boulder. And one of the rising stars, if you will, of this campus is a lady named Dr. Jennifer Balch. And she called me on the phone one time, didn't know her, and it was a voicemail, and the prefix was 202. So if you know that prefix, Washington, D.C., that area. So who's calling me from Washington? Maybe it's the president. He wants to talk to me. He wants to hear my opinion on something. But it was her. And, I think about going back 5 years from this because, there's a great interest today, right, in the world to work with Indigenous people and our knowledges, especially in climate. 2 weeks ago, I had the privilege of serving as a delegate to United Nations Water Summit in New York City. And what a tremendous opportunity. There, you got to speak in 5 minutes, right? You can't go on and on. They'll cut you off. But it was really interesting to be around other Indigenous people around the world talking about the importance of water. There's too much of it, not enough of it, and it's polluted. That was my takeaway. And what are we going to do about it? And what role does education play in that? Here at the University of Colorado, we started something 5 years ago, when we won that proposal, by the way, to start something called the Tribal Climate Leaders Program, a master's program, environmental climate science here. And you know what? This semester, we graduated 2 tribal students out of a cohort of 5, and we had 2 in the PhD program studying climate science. When we started to prepare that proposal, they asked me, what do you think about the role of education? How do we prepare the next generation of climate people to deal with the problems? And I said, well, we need them to get into higher up, we need to get into graduate programs. So James, if you had a chance, what would that graduate program look like here at the University of Colorado Boulder? It would be attractive to tribal students because we know we have an issue attracting and bringing them here and graduating and retaining them. But what's really needed in those tribal communities that this fellowship and this opportunity can address? And I said, we still in Northern Great Plains, where I'm from, We still have these tremendous issues yet, socio-ecological issues yet. And I said, one thing that I think is needed is leadership. We need those kind of people that are leaders, who can work in the world of science and the world of traditional knowledge. And to do that kind of work, it's going to take all of us. And if the university is open to that here, then I think that's what we should do. So there's a number of discussions with all the programs here, faculty and administrators and such, and we got approval to go forward with this. It costs a lot of money to fund those 5 fully funded fellowships here at CU Boulder. It's almost cost prohibitive, but it got done. And now that it's happened, it's ongoing now. It's generating a lot of interest among other centers around the world, around the country, of how did you find those students? Because some of your colleagues, some of my colleagues in the beginning were really challenging us that can this really happen? Can you find 5 tribal students who would come to Boulder to study climate? And so I said, yeah. And they, well, I don't know, James. I could see it in their faces. So they just fueled the passion in me and said, we'll find them. So I got to recruit this program. So I got to travel the highways and byways of North Central of America, talking with tribal students, their parents, their relatives. We went to workshops, went to conferences, and I shook hands with them and told them what this was. And I learned something. Number one, I learned that the University of Colorado Boulder has a positive image, positive reputation in the Indian country. I don't know if you know that, but they do. And you'd be surprised who would say that. When I said I'm representing University of Colorado Boulder today, they stopped and they listened. Like this, I had their attention. Then the young people, I think we had 30 applicants for these 5 positions here, all fully qualified to go to CU Boulder to study degree in environmental climate science. So we're out there, they're out there. And when I talk about reshaping education, to me, it really points at these 2 different ways of knowing. Will the academy allow 2 different ways of knowing to come and to be itself who it is? And not to change it, but it's valid in its own sake. It has integrity in its own sake. And so when we speak on these things to students, we speak to faculty, we talk to funders and philanthropy, that's the work I do, is we talk about what institutions are in place now that are open to these kind of ideas, these kind of curricula, these kind of research projects that will allow Indigenous people to be who they are. Because those students brought that to this program. And I'll wrap up with one story here. So one of the graduate students, I sat on their committee. And when he had to defend his thesis, I got to see his research. And tremendous young man, a lot of responsibility. He's got a family and he's got a responsibility in his community back in South Dakota. But he laid out his research program, and it was a tremendous project. And he was really looking at the climate impacts on Teepsala, which is a prairie turnip. It's very important to our culture. And he was talking about the importance of understanding how we're going to protect our cultural heritage and cultural resources in this time of a changing climate. And he started it. I said, what was your experience like working in your tribal community for them to understand what you're doing? Because as you know, in the past, and maybe even today, research has not really been given to American Indian people. So we're trying to change that. We're trying to develop new policies and procedures that will bring value, will bring benefits to tribal communities, not just to researcher. So here we are, this freshly minted graduate student from CU Boulder, telling us about the importance of climate data, the importance of Western science, but just as important, his traditional way of knowing. And he brought that knowledge, brought that experience, and brought that project to us in a good way. And I'm seeing progress. I'm seeing a university as big as this university begin to consider. But we want to keep going and hoping that my experience here, my work here at CU Boulder, and all the affiliate research centers, everything around this community of Boulder will embrace Indigenous people, will embrace our knowledge, and will open doors, because I think the time is now. As David has mentioned, the crisis thing, we gotta solve this together. That's our imperative today. And those generations that are looking to us like we believe in 7 generations. You've probably heard that comment before. Yeah, that's our responsibility. And so we gotta do our part. So university has a key role in that. I want to see University of Colorado be a leader in working with judicial knowledge and judicial people around the world. And all of us can be part of that. All of us can learn, and because all of us learn, we all have our networks, people can learn and understand what that might be. So I want to say, Wopila Tanke Chichiapalo, thank you for listening. Midankuya Oyasi, all my relations.
Good afternoon. I need a little call and response. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's great to be back here in Boulder. I want to thank CWA for bringing me back. Last year I had a phenomenal time. Really quickly, I want to shout out James Bailey in the back for hosting me again at his house. Let's give a round of applause for him. Super happy to just be a part of this community and continue this conversation. This is a really important topic that we're discussing, and when they reached out to me about coming back again, we really emphasized this part about what does environmental justice look like, particularly within this education space. So if we can all repeat after me. Environmental justice, is racial justice.
Is racial justice.
And racial justice,
is
environmental justice.
environmental justice.
That is a key piece that we have to keep in the foundation of this conversation as we think about reshaping education. I'd like to start with a quote from Malcolm X that says, "Education is the passport to tomorrow for those who prepare for it today." Education is so critical to the climate justice movement, and something that I really focus on within the space I'm in is how do we give access to young Black organizers and activists and student leaders to the climate justice space, because oftentimes we don't see many people of color in those spaces, even though those are the people who are most impacted by the policies and the impacts that these things happen across the nation. Just a little about my own background. I was born in Nigeria, moved to the States in 1995, lived in New York for a little bit, and then grew up in California. And the first time that I ever heard about sustainability was my freshman year in college. Right? They had a whole seminar about what to do in terms of recycling, understanding sustainability, and not even knowing that in my own community, I was practicing this by saving plastic bags underneath in my trash can, right? And reusing those every time we went to the store. And so even small things like that, and making sure that folks understand the ways in which we've already been practicing sustainability, but increasing those practices is absolutely essential. When we think about reshaping education, again, the number one I think about is access, right? Oftentimes there's so many barriers to education for young people of color, and to enter in this conversation. We have to think about how we are tearing down those barriers and starting anew. Something that I consistently work on at the NAACP is really addressing the increased cost for higher education, right? Something that we've been on the forefront currently is about the movement to cancel student debt. This idea that folks said was impossible to happen is a #1 talking point in Washington, D.C. that folks are actually considering, and is now at the highest court in the nation. The Supreme Court will be making a decision about it in June. In addition, we're seeing attacks on campus safety. We just saw this in Michigan where 3 young people were murdered because folks were allowed to come on campus and there was no protocol in place to ensure that young people were safe. And so this idea of we're sending young people to these institutions of higher education, even in our K-12 schools, and folks are not being protected. We're talking about even the access to the right content and material, right? We see this happening out of Florida where they're taking away our access to African American studies, and there are 25 bills and legislations around the country also trying to do the same thing. We have a serious problem on our hands. We are under attack. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to increase access? How are we going to tear down these barriers? And how are we going to make sure that we are being attentive to who's in the room, right? The part of the work that I really am interested in doing and thinking about is, as some of my fellow colleagues talked about, is how are we really addressing these key issues that are impacting us? Someone earlier talked about the digital divide, right? When the pandemic first happened, that was one of the key issues that came to prominence, right? Recognizing that there were so many young people across the nation who didn't have access to laptops, who didn't have access to internet, who didn't have access to regularly interfacing with their teachers and entering into the college classrooms. When we're talking about higher ed, right, we're talking about recruitment and retention, right? What are we doing to ensure that we are recruiting Black students and retaining them in our institutions, right? It's one thing to make sure that you're opening your doors and saying that you are an institution that supports diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's another thing to say that we are doing everything in our power to retain these young people and make sure that they stay here and feel safe in a climate that supports them and their culture. And that all comes down really to the type of curriculum that we are teaching in the classroom. Just as my colleagues have talked about, what are we really teaching people to think about, right? Oftentimes we are going through some of the archaic structures and we haven't reinvented the wheel in quite some time. And so I really hope that in this moment in time that we're taking some time to really rethink what we're teaching, right? How are we ensuring that young people are being prepared for the jobs of the future? Something that I am consistently involved in DC is what are we messaging to the local communities about the changes that are happening, right? The IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is supposed to be the biggest climate investment in US history, right? Half the population doesn't even know about it or really understand it, right? They hear that title and it's like, what does this actually mean? And so making sure, and I tell them this all the time, that the White House has a messaging problem, right? That we are saying these things and saying these big words and all these things, but not making sure that people who are most impacted by it actually understand what's going on and can do something about it. And so really, when we're thinking about the work moving forward, a lot of folks, we've talked about the idea of critical thinking. And something that I consistently see when I interact with professors, when I interact with people in higher ed, is that young people don't necessarily know how to apply the knowledge in the classroom, right? They may be good at test taking, they may be good at writing the papers and essays, but what does that really look like in the real world? And so the question I consistently ask is, what are we doing? I think critical thinking happens when we give people the opportunity to practice advocacy in action. What does that actually look like? When I was a teacher in San Francisco, I taught math, science, and African American studies. And part of the work that I was doing was making sure that my students understood environmental racism, right? What was actually happening and impacting them in the city of San Francisco. Most of my students, suffered from asthma. Most of my students had brothers or sisters that also had asthma, and recognizing that they were also living in food deserts, right, where they didn't have access to the right food sources. There was multiple liquor stores in their communities, but there wasn't a grocery store for miles. And if there was, the produce and the food was multiple days old, right? And so I think it's really important for young people to be able to analyze their lived experience, analyze where they're coming from, and take it from a perspective where they're pushing for advocacy, right? In the city of San Francisco, there was literal legislation that says certain trucks can only go through Black communities, while as for white communities, they're not allowed to go through, right? There's literally legislation happening against our bodies, against our future, and it's important for us to be a part of that process and to ensure that our young people know how to maneuver that system. And so as we're rethinking curriculum, as we're rethinking access, as we're rethinking the ways in which people are entering into education, either through the K through 12 model or higher education, we have to make sure we're asking these important questions and making sure that folks are actually having the opportunity to practice their advocacy in action.
So we have some really great questions building, but before we jump into that, I just wanted to give you all just a few moments are there any reactions that you have to anything that your colleagues have said just now?
To follow on Wisdom's comment, I think there's something that runs through all the comments of the panelists, my fellow panelists here. Several years ago, we did a conference on the state of American democracy, and the closing speaker was William Barber, the great African-American preacher and the founder of the Poor People's Movement. And he ended by saying that our ideas are too puny for our circumstances. And that stuck with me. And all of my colleagues on the panel here are talking about big ideas, not puny ideas: justice, fairness, decency. And James mentioned that there are two ways of knowing, I think, is really critically important. Some of those big ideas that we need to master and develop are on the other side of that scientific divide. It means they're not scientific. It's just science that's seen the world in a different way. Rigor has lots of different forms, as James said. And I think that the call here for the university is to step up to a world where we get out of those little boxes. When I talked about structural problems and disciplinary concerns, most of our incentive structures pull us inward. They're centripetal, not centrifugal. They pull us into a small conversation about highly technical things. And I'm not against technical things, but now the conversation, if we're going to save the planet, if climate change is going to be the mission of this next generation, we have to be beyond just the technicalities of how to do it, but why to do it, what that means, and how to integrate justice and fairness and decency in what we do.
You know, also had a reaction as well. I get the opportunity to serve as a review editor for the National Climate Assessment Tribal and Indigenous chapter. I'm not sure if you guys all know that in terms of that chapter. I'll date myself a little bit. I was part of the first National Climate Assessment back in 1998-99. Just a young guy coming out of college, president of the tribal college I worked there called Sinta Glushka University on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation. Hand me a letter saying there's something called a National Climate Assessment, and James, you got a science background, so I want you to go. So I sat in a room in Atlanta, Georgia, and sat in the back, and I felt like I was drinking from a fire hose. And what I remember about that meeting was that there were two big discussions: the Hadley model versus the Canadian model. Which one's better, or which one's more effective? Which one should we use? So I walked out of that meeting and thinking I was one of the few Native American people there, and wondering what is this all about? And now I look back 20-some years later now, being part of this NCA 5, and we were in a big room like this in Washington, D.C. last week, and the director of the whole program for the NCA said and told the authors, all the authors for the national assessment, that there has to be, or strongly encourage, the importance of what my brother here said about environmental justice in those chapters. Not just the tribal chapter, not just in the other chapters, but all the chapters. So I'm thinking, listening to that, what does that mean? Is this progress in terms of those of us from the tribal nations, for instance, who are disproportionately affected by climate change, and then have the least resistance or the least resilience to deal with those kind of things? How would I talk about that discussion with my elder? I'm really glad the elders are right here in front. Can I call you guys elders? Especially you, sir. Yes, he says yes. And that's my job. That's my role in some way, is to be a communicator of these things to my community, so that they all can't go to Washington, D.C. They all can't be part of the NCA. But again, that's what role do we play in all that? And I think in some ways, to James, are you feeling better or more positive about NCA, what you heard there and what you learned there? And I guess as I get older, I'm becoming a little bit more pragmatic. I am hopeful in a sense that that I'm a grandfather now for the first time. And I look at I have a grandson and a granddaughter, and I look at them and I see them and I say, what world are they going to go into? And all your grandchildren. I just don't think about I think about your grandchildren. And that's an indigenous value. We just don't think about our own. We think about all humanity. And that the thing that I haven't heard yet, what role does spirituality play in all this? This work we're talking about, reshaping education. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
On the spiritual piece, a couple years back, somebody introduced me to the idea or the study of ethnobotany, right? And recognizing our relationships with plants and the way in which we grow. And so I think that's something that we need to dive into more, because it's definitely part of that ethos. So I appreciate you bringing it up.
I was going to start with the first question that came in, but because this is what we're talking about right now, James, you might like this question. No global religion addresses ecological understanding with the appropriate emotions, as does Native American religious practices. How can this knowledge and wisdom be handed to other world religions through education?
Is that for me?
That's for you.
Uh-oh. Well, you ask hard questions here at Boulder.
They're all hard, so sorry.
Very hard. Well, that's good, though. You're making us think and acknowledge our biases and
Not puny.
that's the word, right? We're not puny here. No, no, I do appreciate that, and it is a challenging question for me. I'm going into this new activity now here with our government here. The United States government put together something guidance on federal guidance on elevating traditional ecological knowledge and federal decision making. How many people know about that guidance document here? Just raise your hand if you heard of that before. Higher. Oh, okay. Isn't that interesting? I mean, this guidance document now, we're working into implementation now. So that's where I'm going here in a couple of months back to DC to be part of this working group that's going to be writing the implementation plan for that. Won't that be interesting? I'm really looking forward to that. And sometimes I feel like I'm out of my element on these kind of questions as well, to be honest. You know, there's a certain humbleness that you have to hang on to when you talk about these things, because it's not just another religion as our people. I'm speaking about Lakota people in particular. We've always been pretty forthcoming in sharing our ecosophy, or our philosophy about the world, about worldviews and lands. We've been pretty forthcoming about sharing our spiritual practices with many people around the world. We've been pretty forthcoming about sharing things that we know that a lot of tribes don't do that for their own reasons. One thing that we have to acknowledge, right, is that there is diversity among the 573 federally recognized tribes and all those other tribes in America today. There's diversity, and we're not all the same. We don't have the same spiritual practices, same values. So what's going to be challenging, again, with that guidance document, if something is real, is that how are you going to work with those 573 plus tribal nations and their cultures and their belief systems to put into a government document that agencies then can implement. They can understand and implement. I think there's going to be an opportunity in that work, you know, obviously for training and education. So, you know, who's ready to do that kind of work in terms of working with those agencies, those people that are on the land, right? They see that land every day. The other point I'd say on that question is the role of young people. The good thing about my life right now, where I'm at now, is I get to work kind of where I choose. And it's a good place to be because, you know, I'm a curious person, and so I'm starting to work in Canada with the First Nations up there. And you know, they have a program called the Guardians Program. The Guardians Program, and these young people from the First Nations communities are hired to be on the land, to be on the water, and to go out every single day and observe, collect information, collect data, do water samples and things like that. And on top of that, they are practicing their ways, their spiritual ways and how they see it. That's the next generation that's coming up right now. They're doing that. And those people, those young people, both men and women, are doing that work in a way that I think is going to advance our understanding. And the thing about our belief system is very dynamic as well. So we're a people that are not stuck in time. We're not gone. John Wayne didn't wipe us out. We're still here, and I think those are things that I think are important that we need to continue to work on. So thank you for the question.
Great. We have so many good ones. We're not going to get to all of them. I was told to choose some that might be provocative. So this one's pretty provocative, and I have actually gotten almost the exact same question from my students. So my high school students recently insisted that humanity is a virus that has ruined everything, and that the planet and all life would be better off without us. How would you have responded? You started to speak to this, David, I think.
As an audience, that's child abuse. That is horrible. And they should be fired. But that's
What do you really think? Is there another question for me? No, I'm kidding. Well, we're a mixed blessing. And I think the previous panel in this room got into this issue of whether they're optimistic or pessimistic. And I don't find that particular polarization very helpful. If I'm optimistic, I'll pop the top of another beer and sit back and do nothing. If I'm pessimistic and despair, I'll do nothing. And the trick is to get to the sweet spot, the middle ground, hope. And hope, I want to find, is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. If you're hopeful, as opposed to being optimistic or in despair, you'll do something. Partly because it's fun to do, and partly because that's the way you do things. Years ago, we did a building at Oberlin where I was teaching at the time, and it turned out to be the first entirely solar-powered building on a U.S. college campus. It was also zero discharge. No wastewater left the building. It was designed in part by students, and several of you in this room participated in that project. And what that did, the building was secondary. What that did was to show young people that there was hope, but you reduce the scale of the problem to something they can get their head around. It was a 14,000 square foot building on an acre and a quarter of land. Now, they may not be able to get their head around global warming and all this global stuff, but they can get their head around a building. And then they worked with people that were incredibly creative, courageous. We pulled together a design team of 22 people. Most of the names would be known to all of you in the room. And it was a ton of fun. We did it. The building still stands. It is a net energy exporter. It was a platinum building before it was the platinum rating system. For me, as a, quote, educator, what that building did was to show the way to applied hope. That you do something. It's not just a matter of what you say, oh, I'm optimistic or I'm pessimistic. No. Let's get down to work. And so how many buildings or farms or projects, they don't have to be physical projects, how many things can we get our heads around that need doing? So what's the work in the world that needs to get done? And it's endless. It's also a lot more fun than not doing it. And you meet great people in the process, you learn cooperation, and for young people, I love your land mentors. Because what they learn, and Wisdom said kind of the same thing, what they learn is the face of courage of people who actually do stuff, take risks. And so one of the things I would hope comes out of this thing is to aim for students that are dangerous. Dangerous to cant, hypocrisy, fossil fuels. They're dangerous to the stuff that is compromising the human future. And in this, I'll bet on people. I think we're up to it. It'll be a close call, but I'll bet on it. But
This much?
all right, I'm going to quit. You quit when you get a little applause. So.
Well, I want to say something about that question because I do think that it does require a response, certainly from an indigenous perspective. I was in New York City 2 weeks ago. Have I said that? And I met many generations of indigenous leaders. I call them leaders because they've been doing this for a long time. They're like these gentlemen here, gentlewomen down here, been on that front lines of working to protect their land, their water, and their way of life. And if you talk to them, and if they're willing to share with you, and they were that with me, I was really blessed to listen to them talk about what's happening on their cultures and their lands. And, I went away from that conversation strengthened. So that's a human being, right? To your question about are we a virus? We're not a virus, in my view. But what I saw in those elders and those leaders talking about their ways and sharing and continuing to be on the front lines, fighting development and all those things that are happening in our world, not giving up, having persistence, and in the gentleness of them. So when I looked at them, I thought these are human beings that are at some level now in development that is just, it's amazing. And when they sang songs, when they spoke their language, and when they prayed, to me that was encouragement. and for me to keep carrying on to what I'm doing, and to remind us all here about, the world doesn't revolve around Boulder. The world doesn't revolve around science or economic systems. Somebody said about 80% of lands in terms of biodiversity is stewarded by indigenous people. 80%. If we're going to turn this around, following David Orr's "roll up your sleeves," that's my new quote now. I'm going to roll up my sleeves. I got long sleeves here, but we got to work with the indigenous people, and we got to do it in equitable ways and justice ways that they can benefit as well. So, thank you.
I want to weigh in on this question too. I appreciate, David, you keep bringing up democracy in this conversation, because I think that's so important to this ideology or this question. We have so many conversations about climate and what we're going to do. A couple years ago, I had the opportunity to go to COP in Scotland, where I got to connect with climate activists and organizers and folks who are working and discussing climate all the time. But what we're seeing is that there is a lot of talk and not actions, right? Consistently, particularly for the population I serve, when we look at Gen Z, when we look at millennials, when we look at the promises that our elected leaders had made year after year after year, right? Oftentimes, they don't follow through on those. And so we have to really move from climate talk to climate action. You got to put your money where your mouth is. You have to, as we've said, roll up your sleeves. You have to actually do that work. We have the capability, we have the opportunity, we have the intellectual, prowess to actually make a difference. The question is, do we actually really believe in the future? When I think about Gen Z, and I think about elections, and I think about democracy, in the upcoming years, thinking the 2028 presidential election, the 2032, right? Climate change, climate action is going to be the #1 priority issue for that population. And if you're not talking or actually doing something about it, not just coming into our communities a couple weeks before the election, making promises, what is your policy? What is your plan? How you execute? Because if not, I'm coming to your door and I'm following up with you. I'm making sure that you follow through on those promises, because we need that, right? We're at a critical place in time where we've been talking for this for too long. Right? We have the opportunity to make real investments in this. There are a plethora of green new jobs that are going to be coming into our economy. We need to be training the next generation of young people to fulfill these jobs. But again, it comes back to access, right? You can't access the climate justice space if you haven't been incorporated into it, if it's not in your curriculum, if it's not something that is a part of your day-to-day conversations, right? I imagine a world where young people are consistently conversing in this, discussing this, activating this. It's really important that we give them the opportunity to do that. And so when we think about our current and future generations, we really have to make sure that we are following up with our elected leaders to ensure that they have a real investment, not just for now, but for the future.
Awesome. I wrote down a lot of what you just said, Wisdom, and I have another question that follows up perfectly on this, and I had you pegged as somebody who might want to take this one on. It's a hot topic right now, and then Jevin, I'm coming for you next, because we have a lot on AI coming, a lot on AI. So, Wisdom, what message does a university send to its students when they invest in fossil fuels?
Not a good one. I think it's important for, we've been having these conversations with universities about how do universities weigh the opinions, right? Oftentimes universities have an advisory council, or they work with the student body or the student government when they're making these decisions. And oftentimes, and we actually saw this at Howard University a couple of years ago when they were having a housing situation and crisis, and they basically forbade the young people from speaking out about what was happening in those closed door meetings. And so I think it's absolutely important when universities are having these discussions that young people are involved with it, but I don't think it sends a message because we know that there's so many lies that these fossil fuel companies tell us each and every single day. It's important for us to really expose the myths, expose the lies, and make sure that we are fully aware of the decisions that we're making. right? I think that when young people are a part of the process, we're able to make a decision that is not just best for now. Because I think sometimes we're really short-sighted when we're making financial decisions about where we're investing in. Something I had the privilege and opportunity to be a part of when I was a student organizer in California was the UC's divestment from Wells Fargo, right? This was right before all the predatory lending came out and all that information, and we advocated and fought and went back and forth with the UC president, and we got them to divest, and when all the information came out, they didn't even thank us. They're not even like, oh, like without y'all, like we would still be on the hook for this. And so I think it's really important that young people be a part of it, and if we're being kept out of those rooms, that we continue to fight, right? Everything is about the right tactics and tools, right? Sometimes it's a conversation. Sometimes it's a meeting with a university president. But sometimes you got to escalate. Sometimes you got to sit in. Sometimes you got to sleep out. Sometimes you got to boycott. Sometimes you got to walk out, especially when these institutions aren't serving us for our future.
Thank you. So moving on to, and we are running low on time. I got the 10-minute warning. So we have 3 questions related to AI, so I'll kind of blend them all together if that's okay. What role do you think AI and AGI will play on the future of education in general and higher in education in particular? Will robots be teaching our kids? And how will education adapt to job loss as AI replaces workers in many fields?
So those are questions that I'm thinking about almost every day now. So thanks for the questions. First of all, we're not at AGI level. This is for those that have been hearing debates online. We haven't reached that for sure. I think what we have is technology. If you've looked at these chatbots, is a technology that's great at fluency. It looks like it's been written by humans. But it's not the same. It's very, very different, and I think that confusion is leading to all sorts of hype and billions and billions and billions of dollars being invested in this technology right now so that you could have a technology write your thank you letters instead. So this is imagine if we invested billions and billions of dollars into some of these issues around climate that we've talked about, or some of these issues around some of these social issues. I think would be a good investment, but that's where the money is going. It is here to stay, unfortunately. I'm actually a pretty strong critic of some of these technologies. I think, these chatbots in particular, the things that scare me the most is that they can bullshit at scale. So a lot of my students say, well, would you get rid of a calculator? It's just like a calculator. Well, would you use a calculator that's wrong 20% of the time? I'm not sure I would. And so this is the kind of technology that we're at, and being able to scale these and flood our public commentary when it comes to democratic discussions, its ability to be put in the hands of authoritarian governments that can do the kinds of things, this very much scares me. And we're seeing it. Actually, these are the things that we're studying right now. And so students ask me, in what ways can it be used in education? I think there probably are some ways it can help people free themselves from writer's block. It can help them sort of, find summaries, but they need to know what the guardrails are. They also need to know that it's incredibly expensive to our environment. So there's a whole new area growing in sort of called green AI, which is dealing with this challenge of the cost of, trying to solve the blockchain and dealing with the cost of cryptocurrency and the cost now of these chatbots. There was an interesting analysis that was done recently looking at the cost per query right now in the old-fashioned, it's already called old-fashioned, Google search query. So if you search something, there is a cost. You can actually figure out what the cost is by going and looking at all the amount of data and machinery, computational machinery that's needed to make that query land on your laptop. Now, in order for these chatbots to do what they do, it's almost an order of magnitude, if not orders of magnitude more expensive. I don't know the exact amount, but it's incredibly expensive to do that. So there's these kinds of costs. But the cost that I'm most concerned about when it comes to technology is also taking away a student's chance to think about. So when we have students write essays, it's not even about the output, honestly. It's about teaching them to think. And if you have chatbots, what students are using it, like I said, I allowed it in my classroom and many, many students used it. That's a concern to me that it takes away that ability to think. So the technology certainly scares me. Here's one other thing. I could talk about it ad nauseum, but I'll just say one other thing is that we can't reverse engineer the problems. That to me is a huge concern. So if we find that it becomes, we know that these bots have these racist tendencies, they're biased, they have we've seen many, many, many examples, we'll see more. And what happens now is you put a Band-Aid on it. I know because I teach classes in machine learning that with these large language models, you can't go back and see, well, where did that come from? Now they're pretending right now because they're getting a lot of criticism for not having references and sources for those summaries on these chatbots. The problem is that those are done ad hoc, or sort of post hoc. They're done after the case, which is even worse to me because now it looks like an official summary with official references. It looks like an official document, almost like it came from a research lab at a university like this. That to me is even more concerning, and that's one of the core definitions of a bullshitter. Look like you're an expert, but have no allegiance to truth. All right, so.
Amen. In 1948, Norbert Wiener, who was a great mathematician, maybe the greatest of the 20th century, wrote a little article saying, in effect, that when all of this AI stuff comes to a certain point, acquires sentience, we have no good reason to believe that it will be kindly disposed to us, quote unquote. That was a warning in 1948. We've had dozens of hundreds of people with similar kind of credentials saying roughly the same thing. Now, I want to point out something that Wisdom mentioned. This is an issue of democracy. In 1994, remember a guy by the name of Georgia Congressman Newt Gingrich, you remember that name? He canceled out the budget for the Office of Technology Assessment. We have this is like we're making these decisions willy-nilly by over here in the private sector, mostly out of sight, about things that will fundamentally alter the human prospect. Not just climate change, but this whole AI technology. It's a huge issue of democracy or the failure of democracy. Nobody here voted for this. Nobody here was told. We didn't have a national debate about what this stuff is. And this is something, we have a book coming out called Democracy in a Harder Time. It comes out this summer from MIT Press. One of the essays in the book is called deals with the issue of no innovation without representation. Let's talk about this stuff before we cross the threshold of the irrevocable and we can't go back. Let's talk, let's have a conversation, because this is one of those this is not like inventing a better drug to cure your headache or whatever. This is a fundamental alteration in truth. And the way we deal with knowledge and information and so forth, and it risks, our humanity is at risk on this. We've had no national debate and dialogue about it. So anyway, I'll let it go at that.
I'll just add one point
We
that
have
adds
30
as
seconds, just so you
okay, just
know.
as a third, as an accelerant for this. So in the Seattle area, where I live, there's been a lot of tech layoffs, and there have been groups that have been looking at where those where the layoffs are coming from. And one of the common groups that gets released last, which is not representation, but it is at least groups that are sort of looking at the safety and the ethics behind these kinds of things, are the ones getting chopped first. And so this is a technology that really could lead to all sorts of negative worlds that we could imagine, and those are the kinds of things that are getting laid off. And so it really concerns me, and I really like this idea of representation when it comes to this kind of technology.
With that, we do have to close. Let's please give our wonderful speakers a round of applause.
Yeah, me too. Oh my gosh, I was like trying to quote every quote.
And I'm guessing they'll hang out for a few minutes if you have follow-up questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them.
I'm going to DC.
Spicy questions.
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.